Elizabeth always thought it was too late to dream of love at her age. In her 60s, she had a small apartment in the city center, modest savings, and a job as an accountant at a local firm. After her husband's death 15 years ago, she devoted herself to working and raising her daughter Anna, who now lived in another city with her family. The apartment she lived in was her only significant possession, an inheritance from her parents that she cherished as the apple of her eye. The small savings she had accumulated over the years gave her a sense of security and independence. Her life was steady and predictable, until one spring day, Richard Anderson opened her office door. "Excuse me, I'm looking for an accountant." His deep voice made her look up from her papers. "It's me," Elizabeth replied, adjusting her glasses. "How can I help you?" Richard was a successful businessman who had recently purchased the building next door for a new restaurant. His gray hair beautifully set off his tanned face, and his brown eyes shone with sincere interest. His elegant suit and expensive watch gave him away as a wealthy man, but he tried to keep it simple. "You know, Miss Elizabeth Pierce," she introduced herself. "Elizabeth," he repeated with a warm smile. "I was advised to come to you. They say you're the best specialist in town." Their first business meeting lasted 2 hours. Richard turned out to be a great conversationalist, smart, witty, and attentive. He listened to her accounting advice with undisguised interest, asked intelligent questions, and seemed to really value her professional opinion. "Maybe—" He hesitated at the end of the meeting. "Could we discuss this over dinner? I know a great Italian restaurant nearby." Elizabeth hesitated. She hadn't been on a date in a long time and felt uncomfortable. "I don't know. It's not really professional. It's just dinner." Richard insisted gently. "I promise not to talk about work." The next 3 months flew by like a day. Richard showed up at her office with flowers, invited her to the best restaurants in town, and took her to concerts. He was gallant, attentive, and seemed genuinely fascinated by her. Elizabeth felt like she was in a fairy tale. "You are so special," he said, kissing her hand. "I don't understand how other men could pass you by." Her daughter Anna was wary of her mother's new suitor at first. "Mom, you don't know him at all," she said over the phone. "Be careful." But Elizabeth was fascinated. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Richard knew how to make every day special. He would invite her to a picnic in the countryside, arrange a romantic candlelit dinner, or give her tickets to her favorite opera. "You changed my life," he said one evening as they sat in his cozy office. There was a bottle of expensive wine on the table and soft music playing. "I never imagined it was possible to be so happy." "Richard," Elizabeth whispered, feeling her heart ready to jump out of her chest. "Marry me." He took a velvet box from his pocket. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I'm sure you're the one I've been looking for all my life." Tears of happiness clouded her eyes. "Yes," she answered without even thinking. Richard put a diamond ring on her finger and hugged her tightly. "There is only one formality," he said, kissing her temple. "We need to sign a prenuptial agreement, just to protect us both. You know it's a common practice at our age." Elizabeth tensed, but nodded. "Of course, dear, whatever you say." "Don't worry," he whispered in her ear. "It's just a piece of paper. What matters is our love." She didn't notice the change in his gaze when she turned away, the cold calculation momentarily eclipsing the warmth in his eyes. He squeezed her tighter in his arms, as if afraid to let go of his prey. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep for a long time. She looked at the ring sparkling in the moonlight and thought about her happiness. But deep down inside, she was uneasy. Why was he so insistent on a prenup? Why doesn't he want to wait with the wedding? And why do his eyes sometimes become so cold when he thinks she can't see? She pushed these thoughts away, convincing herself that it was just a fear of change. After all, wasn't this the kind of happiness she had dreamed of? Doesn't she deserve to be loved? With these thoughts in mind, she finally fell asleep, not realizing that her fairy tale would soon begin to turn into a nightmare. "Are you crazy?" Mary put down her cup of tea so abruptly that the hot liquid spilled onto the saucer. "Elizabeth, you've only known him for 3 months." They were sitting in their favorite coffee shop, where they had met every week for the past 20 years. Mary, a lawyer's widow, had been Elizabeth's closest friend since their children went to the same kindergarten. But Mary, he's so special. Elizabeth twirled her engagement ring on her finger. You should see how he takes care of me. I've seen special before. Mary smiled bitterly. My sister married someone just as caring. Do you know how it ended? He swindled her out of her life savings and disappeared. Richard is not like that. Elizabeth defended herself. He's a successful businessman. He has his own restaurants. And why would such a successful businessman suddenly need a prenuptial agreement? Mary leaned forward. Have you even read what it says? Elizabeth hesitated. Not yet. He says it's a standard document, just a formality. A formality? Mary shook her head. Honey, nothing is just a formality at our age. You have an apartment downtown, savings. Are you implying that he's with me for the money? Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush with resentment. Mary, he's richer than me. Have you checked? Mary raised an eyebrow. Have you seen his business papers? Maybe he's in debt? Elizabeth opened her mouth to reply, but realized she didn't know the answer. She suddenly realized how little she knew about Richard, his past, his business, his family. He said he was married, she mumbled, but he divorced a long time ago. And what happened to his first wife? Mary persisted. Why did they divorce? Where is she now? Each question hit her like a hammer. Elizabeth felt her confidence shake. I didn't ask. Listen to me. Mary took her hand. I don't want to ruin your happiness, but before you sign any papers, check everything out. Go to a lawyer, have him read the contract, and ask about Richard, where he used to live, what he used to do. He'll be offended if he finds out, Elizabeth whispered. If he has nothing to hide, why should he be offended? Mary squeezed her hand. Better an insult now than a broken heart later. That evening, Elizabeth stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the city lighting up the evening lights. She remembered every moment with Richard, his gentle words, warm hugs, generous gifts. But now a shadow of doubt appeared in those memories. The phone vibrated, a message from Richard. Sweet dreams, my queen. Tomorrow at 8? Elizabeth looked at the screen, and for the first time in their relationship, she felt anxiety rather than joy. She typed a reply. I'm sorry, I can't make it tomorrow. I have an urgent job. It was the first lie in their relationship, but she had time to think about it, and maybe check some of the things Mary had said. A thick folder of documents lay on the table between them. Richard casually flipped through the pages as if it were a regular newspaper, not a document that would determine their future. They were sitting in his study, a luxurious room with dark wood paneling and heavy velvet curtains. Elizabeth had always felt a little uncomfortable here, as if in a museum where you were afraid of touching something. It's simple, my dear. He smiled, handing her a pen. A standard contract protects the rights of both parties. I've already consulted with lawyers. They've checked everything. Elizabeth took the folder with trembling hands. The legal terms were blurring before her eyes. The complex wording was confusing. She tried to concentrate, but the letters were jumping in front of her eyes. Can I read it at home first? In a quiet environment? Richard frowned, his face distorted for a moment in displeasure, but he quickly composed himself. Why put it off? It's nothing complicated. Look. He turned to the first page. It's about community property. This is about personal property, and this is about the case of divorce. Divorce? Elizabeth flinched. We're not even married yet, and you're already thinking about divorce? Darling. Richard took her hand, his fingers cold. It's just a formality. At our age, we have to think about the future. I want you to be protected. You're so trusting. I don't want anyone to hurt you. Protected from what? She asked quietly, feeling something cold settle in her chest. From everything. He stroked her hand. Do you know how many scammers there are now? And this way, everything will be official, legitimate. I just want you to feel safe. Elizabeth began to read. There were a lot of unclear terms in the document, but some things caught her eye. What does this waiver of claims to business assets clause mean? And why does it say transfer of property management rights? Oh, it's a standard clause. Richard waved his hand, but his eyes sparkled for a moment. Just to separate personal and business. You don't want to be involved in restaurants, do you? You have your own job, your own business. No, but very well. He held out the pen again. Shall we sign it? I have an important meeting in an hour. I need time. Elizabeth pushed the folder away. I want to read everything carefully. This is a serious step. You don't trust me? He sounded irritated. He stood up and walked around the office. After everything we've been through? After all my gifts? After everything I've done for you? It's not about trust. She tried to smile, but it was crooked. It's just, this is an important document. I want to know what I'm signing. Okay. Richard stopped abruptly. Take it home. But don't take too long. The wedding is in a month. We need to get everything organized. And don't show it to anyone. It's our private business. At home, Elizabeth read every line for a long time. Some of the wording seemed strange. Why did she have to give up her right to compensation in the event of a divorce? Why did her apartment have to become jointly owned? And what did the clause on the right to manage joint assets mean? Why were all the property clauses so vague, yet so insistent? She remembered the way Richard had reacted to her questions, that brief flash of irritation, the cold glint in his eye. She had never seen him like that before. He had always been gentle, attentive, caring. But today she saw a different side of him. Elizabeth pulled out her phone and found Mary's number. Her hand trembled as she pressed the call button. You were right, she said when her friend answered the phone. I do need help. About time. Mary sighed. Do you know a good lawyer? No. Then listen, there's a guy named George who specializes in prenups. Very experienced, many years of practice. Can you make it tomorrow at 10? But Richard said not to show it to anyone. That's exactly why you need to show him. Mary's voice became hard. If it's all clean, why is he afraid someone will see? The next morning, Elizabeth called Richard. Honey, I need a few more days. There are a lot of unclear terms. What terms? His voice was as cold as ice. Don't you trust me? Maybe you've already changed your mind about getting married? I do, but... Okay. He interrupted. You can read it if you want. But don't forget, I'm doing this for you, for our future. And don't forget, the wedding invitations have already been sent out. After hanging up the phone, Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong with his voice. Something that made her heart clench with fear. She looked down at her engagement ring, the diamond glinting faintly in the morning light. Was it too high a price to pay for that shine? George Peterson's office was modest, but cozy, without the ostentatious luxury that Richard's office boasted. The lawyer himself, a gray-haired man of about 65, listened attentively to Elizabeth, taking notes from time to time. So, he insists on signing it immediately? George took off his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief. And the wedding is in a month? I wonder, is something wrong? Elizabeth nervously clutched her purse. Let's see the documents. He opened the folder. He read silently, frowning from time to time. After 20 minutes, he put the papers down and looked at Elizabeth for a long time. Miss Pierce, do you understand what you are signing? Not really. There's a lot of legalese in there. That's exactly what it's for. George pushed the papers toward him. Look, this clause actually gives your husband the right to dispose of your apartment. This one gives him control of your bank accounts, and this one deprives you of the right to compensation in the event of a divorce. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. But he said it was for my protection. Protection? George smiled bitterly. This contract only protects his interests. More than that. He turned the page. There's a clause that gives him the right to manage all of your property as a trustee. What does that mean? It means that he can sell your property, take out loans against it, manage your money, all without your consent. Elizabeth remembered all the expensive gifts, restaurants, concerts. But he has money. I saw. Have you seen his tax returns? His business records? Bank statements? George looked her straight in the eye. Or was he just telling you about his success? She was silent. In fact, she had never seen any documents, only beautiful gestures and expensive gifts. And one more thing. George pulled out some paper. I checked. Over the past year, 3 restaurants he supposedly owns have gone bankrupt. He has huge debts registered in his name. Oh my God, Elizabeth whispered. What am I supposed to do? The first thing is not to sign this contract. Second, he paused. Don't show that you suspect anything. Say you need time to think about it. In the meantime, I'll try to find out more about your fiancé. As Elizabeth left the office, the phone rang. It was Richard. Honey, where are you? I'll pick you up. Can we have lunch together? I'm at work, she lied. Lots of urgent things to do. That's odd. His voice turned cold. I just drove by your office. They said you took the day off. Elizabeth froze in the middle of the street. Are you checking up on me? I'm worried about you. He sounded steely. By the way, have you read the contract? Can we sign it tonight? I need more time. There is no time, dear. Either we sign today or... He didn't finish his sentence. Or what? She whispered. Or I'll start thinking that you don't trust me. And without trust, what's the point of getting married? After hanging up the phone, Elizabeth felt her knees tremble. She looked around and thought someone was watching her. The street was empty, but the feeling of danger did not let go. We have to be careful. George spread the papers on the table. I've found out something about your fiancé, and it's not good news. Elizabeth sat in his office for the 3rd time in a week. She hadn't slept much since Richard's call, mulling over the situation. It turns out he's already been married 3 times. The lawyer pulled out some documents, and all his ex-wives were left penniless. The scheme is always the same: a marriage contract, transfer of property, and then divorce. It can't be, Elizabeth whispered. He said he was only married once. Unfortunately, he has. Here are the court papers. The last case was 2 years ago. His ex-wife tried to challenge the contract, but to no avail. Everything was legally flawless. Elizabeth remembered all his gentle words, warm hugs, romantic dinners. Was it all just a game? What to do? She felt tears welling up in her eyes. We have 2 options. George folded his fingers into a house. The first is that you simply refuse the wedding, but then he could become dangerous. The second is that we play his game, but by our rules. What do you mean? We agree to the contract, but make our own changes. Changes that he won't notice right away, but that will protect you. He'll never agree. He will. George smiled. Because we'll do it quietly. He thinks you're naive and trusting. That's our advantage. That evening, Elizabeth met with Richard. He was tense, but tried to hide it. Honey, I'm worried. He took her hand. You seem distant. Have you changed your mind? Of course not, darling. She smiled, trying to keep her voice from trembling. It's just that this contract, it's so complicated. Is there anything we could do to simplify it? Simplify? His eyes narrowed. Yes, make it more understandable. I asked a friend of mine, she works as a secretary in a law firm, to retype it in simpler language. Do you mind? Richard relaxed. Of course, dear, as long as the message remains the same. Of course. She squeezed his hand. I trust you. The next day, she and George worked on a new version of the contract. Every word, every comma, was carefully chosen, so that at first glance it looked simple, but legally the document would protect her rights. The key is not to show that you suspect anything, George reminded. Be as nice and trusting as possible. Let him think he's winning. Elizabeth nodded. For the first time in days, she felt something like hope. Maybe she could outsmart the man who wanted to deceive her. And then she would show him that she was not as naive as he thought. We have to be careful. George spread the papers on the table. I've found out something about your fiancé, and it's not good news. Elizabeth sat in his office for the 3rd time in a week. She hadn't slept much since Richard's call, thinking about the situation. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, so gentle and loving at first glance. but now she noticed something predatory in it. It turns out he's already been married 3 times. The lawyer pulled out some documents, and all his ex-wives were left penniless. The scheme is always the same: a marriage contract, transfer of property, and then divorce. And each time he followed the same scenario: expensive gifts, romantic dinners, promises of eternal love. "It can't be," Elizabeth whispered, feeling the ground slipping away from under her feet. "He said he was only married once. He said his wife died." Unfortunately, she may have. Here are the court documents. The last case was 2 years ago. His ex-wife, Margaret Wilson, tried to challenge the contract, but to no avail. Everything was legally flawless. She lost her house, her savings, even her share of the joint business. Elizabeth recalled all his gentle words, warm hugs, romantic dinners, how he gave her flowers, how he told her about his lonely life, how he dreamed of their future together. Was it all just a game? A well-planned scenario? "And the others?" she asked in a trembling voice. "The first wife, Helen Brooks, lost everything in 2015. The second, Patricia Morrison, in 2018. They both went through the same thing: a quick fling, a lavish wedding, and then complete ruin." What to do? She felt tears coming to her eyes. "He's not going to leave me alone. We have 2 options." George folded his fingers into a house. "The first is that you simply call off the wedding, but then he could become dangerous. I saw how he treated Margaret, threatening, stalking. The second is that we play his game, but by our rules." "What do you mean?" "We agree to the contract, but make our own changes. Changes that he won't notice right away, but that will protect you. He thinks you're a sitting duck. We'll exploit that." "He'll never agree." "He will." George smiled. "Because we'll do it quietly. He thinks you're naive and trusting. That's our advantage. We'll draw up a document so that at first glance everything will be as he wants. But in the details..." That evening, Elizabeth met with Richard. He was tense, but he tried to hide it. She saw him constantly checking his phone, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. "Honey, I'm worried." He took her hand. "You seem distant. Maybe you've changed your mind. Maybe someone said something to you?" "No, darling." She smiled, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "It's just that this contract, it's so complicated. Is there anything we could do to simplify it? Make it more understandable?" "Simplify?" His eyes narrowed, and for a moment she saw something cold and calculating in them. "Yes, make it more understandable. I asked a friend of mine, she works as a secretary in a law firm, to reprint it in simpler language. You know I'm not good with legalese." Richard relaxed, a condescending smile on his face. "Of course you do, my dear. The main thing is that the essence remains the same. I only want to protect you." "Of course." She squeezed his hand, disgusted by her own lie, but realizing it was necessary. "I trust you." The next day, she and George worked on a new version of the contract. Every word, every comma, was carefully chosen, so that at first glance it looked simple, but legally the document would protect her rights. "We'll add a clause to preserve your right to the apartment," George explained. "But we'll disguise it as a standard personal property clause. We'll add protection for your savings, but in the section on the joint budget. The main thing is that he doesn't suspect." "The main thing is not to show that you suspect anything," George reminded us at the end of the meeting. "Be as nice and trusting as possible. Let him think he is winning. By the time he realizes the truth, it will be too late." Elizabeth nodded. For the first time in days, she felt something like hope. Maybe she could outsmart the man who wanted to deceive her. And then she would show him that she wasn't as naive as he thought. She would protect not only herself, but also perhaps become the last victim of his machinations. On her way home, she noticed Richard's familiar car on the next street. Was he following her? Her heart beat faster, but she forced herself to calm down. Every step she took now had to be calculated. Too much depended on her restraint. The week after the meeting with the lawyer turned out to be the hardest in Elizabeth's life. Richard seemed to sense danger. He became more insistent, more controlling. He called several times a day, unexpectedly appeared at her office, and sent her expensive gifts. "Honey, I made us a table at La Belle," he said one evening. That pianist you love so much is playing there tonight." Elizabeth shuddered. She had never told him about her love of classical music. How did he know? I can't tonight," she said. "I have an emergency." "Again?" His voice turned icy. "You've been working too much lately? Maybe it's something else? Maybe you're seeing someone?" "What are you talking about?" "I don't know." He sighed. "I'm just worried. You've become so distant. And this prenup? Do you know how much the wedding invitations cost? And the restaurant? And your wedding dress?" "I didn't ask." "Of course you didn't. I just wanted to do the best for you, because I love you. But if you don't trust me—" Elizabeth felt nausea rising in her throat. Every word he said was like a poisoned arrow, straight to the point. "I do, I just—" "Just what?" he interrupted. "Do you know how many women your age dream of such happiness? Of a man who will take care of them, protect them? But you don't seem to appreciate it." "Richard, No, listen." His voice was softer, but still tinged with menace. "There's a reason I'm insisting on a contract. I want to protect our future. But if you're not ready—" "I am," she said quickly. "Just give me a little more time." "Time?" He laughed. "Do you know what will happen if we postpone the wedding? Everyone will start talking. What will your coworkers say? Your neighbors? Your daughter?" Elizabeth grew cold. "What does this have to do with Anna?" "Nothing." He laughed again. "Just thinking about how embarrassed she'll be when everyone finds out her mother is such an ungrateful person." There was a hidden threat in his words, and Elizabeth felt it. Did he know where Anna lived? What else did he know? "Let's meet tomorrow," she suggested, trying to keep her voice calm. "We can talk about everything." "Okay." He softened. "By the way, I bought you a present, a little diamond bracelet to match your engagement ring." Elizabeth looked at the ring on her finger. Now it seemed to her not a symbol of love, but a shackle. That night she could not sleep for a long time. She remembered all their conversations, all their meetings. How did he know her tastes? Who told him about her habits and preferences? Had he been watching her even before their first meeting? The phone rang again. It was a message from Richard. "Sweet dreams, my queen. By the way, that new blue blouse looks great on you." Elizabeth abruptly got out of bed and went to the window. The street was empty, but she could have sworn she saw a shadow by a parked car. She dialed George's number. "He's pressuring me," she whispered. "And I think he's watching me." "Hang in there," the lawyer replied. "We're almost done with the new version of the contract. A few more days and it will be ready. The main thing is not to show fear." But fear had already settled in her heart. Fear that did not let go for a moment. And the worst part was that she didn't know if she could outwit the man who seemed to know everything about her. The day of the signing was approaching. Elizabeth and George worked late, carefully reviewing every clause of the new contract. The document had to look simple and straightforward, but contained strong legal protections. "Look," George pointed to another clause. "Here we added a provision to preserve your right to the apartment, but we disguised it as a standard premarital property clause." Elizabeth read the text. Now she realized how subtle it was to hide the true meaning behind legalese. "And here," the lawyer continued, "is a clause about your savings. At first glance, it seems that we are talking about a joint family budget, but legally, it guarantees you full control over your accounts." "He won't notice?" "Hardly. Such people are usually overconfident. He's sure that you don't understand the legal intricacies." Suddenly, Elizabeth's phone rang. It was Richard. "Honey, what's going on with the contract? Do you want to meet today? We can discuss the last details." I'm still working on it." She tried to sound calm. "You know, I asked a friend to help me with the wording. I want it to be clear." "A friend?" He sounded wary. "What friend?" "Mary. She works at a law firm as a secretary. She just helps with the terminology." "Oh, the same Mary who lives on Oak Street?" His tone turned sweet. "Her house is beautiful, and her grandchildren are so sweet. They play in the yard every day." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. How did he know about Mary? About her grandchildren? Yes, she mumbled. Well, that's great. So how about we sign it tomorrow? I've already made an appointment with the notary. I need a day or two more. Honey. His voice was hard. The wedding is in 2 weeks. Everyone is getting ready. Your daughter has already bought a plane ticket. Don't disappoint me. After hanging up, Elizabeth turned to George. He knows about Mary. He knows about her family. He's been following everyone close to me. That's typical of a manipulative person. The lawyer nodded. They gather information to use later to put pressure. But don't worry, we're almost done. They worked non-stop for the next 2 days. George added a few clauses on the protection of property rights, disguising them as standard clauses. He added a clause about compensation in the event of divorce, but it was so subtly worded that it seemed like a simple description of the divorce procedure. It's done, he finally said. Now this contract protects you, not him, but it looks the same as the one he brought in the first time. What if he notices? He won't. Such people rarely read into details. They are used to everyone obeying them. The main thing is to behave as usual. Be nice, trusting. Like a victim. Elizabeth smiled bitterly. Exactly. Let him think he's winning, and when he realizes the truth, it will be too late. In the evening, Elizabeth called Richard. Honey, I finished the contract. We can sign it tomorrow. Great. He couldn't hide his joy. I knew you would understand. I'll make a reservation at a restaurant and we'll celebrate. Of course. She smiled into the phone. Whatever you say, darling. At night, she looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Who was this woman? The same gullible Elizabeth who believed in the fairy tale of late love? Or is she someone else? Someone who has learned to play a dangerous game? And most importantly, will she have the strength to see this game through? Morning came too quickly. Elizabeth put on her best suit and light makeup. She had to look confident, but not too confident. Nervous, but happy. The documents were in her purse, a few sheets of paper that would either protect her future or destroy it forever. The notary's office was exactly what she expected, strict and official. Richard was already waiting there, elegant in his expensive suit. When he saw Elizabeth, he smiled broadly and kissed her on the cheek. Finally, my dear, I thought you had changed your mind. Of course not, dear. Elizabeth smiled, trying to keep her voice from trembling. It's just a little traffic. The notary, an elderly woman with a sharp eye, spread the documents on the table. So, a marriage contract? Both parties are familiar with the terms? Yes, Richard smiled indulgently. We've discussed everything, haven't we, my dear? Elizabeth nodded, pulling a folder of documents from her purse. I've prepared the final version, the one we agreed on. Richard took a quick glance at the papers. Oh, I see you've simplified things. Good for you. The notary began to read the contract aloud, a standard procedure. Elizabeth felt like her heart was about to leap out of her chest. Now he would notice. Realize. But Richard just nodded casually, glancing at his watch from time to time. Yes, that's right. Can I sign it? First, I need to make sure that both parties understand their rights and obligations. The notary looked at Elizabeth. Do you understand everything? Yes. Her voice sounded surprisingly firm. Everything is very clearly written. Richard had already taken out his pen. Well, dear, are you ready to become Mrs. Anderson? Elizabeth took the pen with trembling fingers. A signature, another, and another, on every page, as required by law. Richard signed quickly, confidently, without even reading the text. Congratulations. The notary stamped the last page. The contract is now legally binding. On the way out of the office, Elizabeth felt Richard squeeze her elbow tightly. You see, it was simple. And you were worried. Yes, darling, you were right. Of course I was. He smiled smugly. I'm always right. By the way, I've already arranged to sell your apartment. What do we need it for? I have a wonderful house. Elizabeth almost stumbled. Selling it? Yes, there is a good buyer. We'll sign the power of attorney tomorrow, and I'll arrange everything. But, according to the contract, According to the contract, I have the right to dispose of our joint property. He patted her hand. Don't worry about such trifles. I'll take care of it. Of course, darling, she whispered, feeling a cold sweat trickle down her back. Whatever you say. At home, she immediately called George. He wants to sell the apartment. Tomorrow! Calm down. The lawyer's voice was confident. Let him try. According to the new version of the contract, he has no such rights. But don't tell him about it yet. Let him think everything is going according to his plan. What if he forces me to sign a power of attorney? Don't sign anything. Say you don't feel well, that you have a headache, that tomorrow. The main thing is to hold out until the wedding. And if he did notice the substitution, then you would have known about it by now. George sighed. People like that don't know how to hide their anger. If he's calm, it means he didn't suspect anything. Elizabeth slept little that night. She imagined how angry Richard would be when he realized he had been deceived. When he found out that the document he had so carelessly signed was actually protecting her, not his interests. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something like pride. She had done it. She had outsmarted someone who thought she was easy prey. And now the main thing is to hold out a little longer, to wait for the moment when she could throw off the mask of a submissive bride. The phone vibrated, a message from Richard. Sleep well, darling. Tomorrow is a big day. We're going to start a new life. Yes, she whispered into the darkness. A new life, but not the one you're planning. What do you mean? I have no right to dispose of the property. Richard flushed with rage. There must be some mistake. There has to be a mistake. They were sitting in his lawyer's office, a small room with pretentious leather furniture and paintings that were meant to demonstrate the owner's status. On the massive oak desk was an open prenuptial agreement, each page of which now seemed to Richard like a poisoned blade. I'm afraid not. The lawyer nervously adjusted his tie, avoiding his client's direct gaze. Under this agreement, you are not authorized to sell or dispose of Miss Pierce's property without her written consent. Furthermore, all previous powers of attorney are null and void. But there were other terms. Richard grabbed the papers with trembling hands. I drew up this contract myself. I remember every clause. This is what you signed. The lawyer pointed to the signatures certified by the notary. The document is perfectly legal. Richard slowly turned to Elizabeth. His face, usually so friendly and charming, was distorted by a grimace of unconcealed hatred. The mask fell away, revealing his true self. You planned this? Have you been pretending to be a gullible fool all this time? Elizabeth felt her knees tremble, but her voice was firm. Just as you planned to take all my property? How you pretended to be in love? I don't know what you mean. He tried to smile, but it was crooked, predatory. I was just trying to protect our future. Really? What about Margaret Wilson? Or Helen Brooks? Or Patricia Morrison? Elizabeth pulled out a file folder. Your previous wives, the ones you ruined, the ones whose futures you also protected? Richard froze, his face turning white as chalk. Who told you that? Who dug into my past? That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that your plan didn't work. This time, you didn't meet a defenseless victim. And you know what? You signed your own defeat. You think you're so smart? He stood up, looming over her like a predatory animal. You think you can play with me? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Sit down, Mr. Anderson. Elizabeth's voice turned icy. Otherwise, I'll call the police. By the way, they've taken a great deal of interest in the bankruptcy case of your restaurants, and those strange money transfers before each bankruptcy. Richard slowly sank into his chair. His self-confidence was melting before his eyes. What do you want? I want you out of my life. I want you out of my life forever. Forget about the wedding. Forget about me. And don't even think about revenge. All the documents about your fraud are already in a safe place. One call from me and they will be in the hands of the police. You're going to regret this, he hissed. No one can do this to me. Maybe. Elizabeth stood up. But not as much as I would have regretted marrying you. Goodbye, Richard. And don't try to find me. I won't be so merciful next time. She walked out of the office with her head held high, feeling his hateful gaze on her. Only in the taxi did she allow herself to cry, but they were tears of relief. The nightmare was over. The phone rang. Mary. Well, did you make it? Yes. Elizabeth wiped away her tears. It's over. He won't fool anyone else. I'm proud of you. Her friend's voice was warm. You were stronger than he thought, than anyone thought. Than we all thought, Elizabeth corrected. You know, I realized something important. It's never too late to learn to defend yourself, and it's never too late to start a new life. At home, she stood in front of the mirror for a long time, looking at her face. It was still the same Elizabeth, but different, stronger, wiser, with a new sparkle in her eyes, and, perhaps for the first time in a long time, truly free. Her engagement ring was still in her jewelry box, a mute witness to her greatest victory. Not over Richard, but over her own fears and doubts. Over the part of herself that was afraid of being alone, that was ready to believe a beautiful lie. Thank you, she whispered, looking at the ring. You taught me the most important thing, to believe in myself. 6 months passed after those dramatic events. Elizabeth sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking through the morning mail. Among the envelopes, one caught her eye, from George's lawyer. Dear Miss Pierce, he wrote, I feel it is my duty to inform you that Richard Anderson has left town. According to my sources, he has moved to another state. It seems that your story was a serious lesson for him, as no more complaints about his fraud have been received. Elizabeth smiled as she recalled the day she finally shed her mask of submissive bride. Richard tried to threaten her, even hired a private detective to find dirt on her, but she was no longer afraid. Elizabeth? Mary rang the doorbell. Are you ready? The concert starts in an hour. Yes, come in. She put down the letter. You know, Richard's out of town. Finally. Mary breathed a sigh of relief. Now you can live in peace. I have been living in peace for a long time. Elizabeth stood up. You know, sometimes I'm even grateful to him. Grateful? To this crook? Yes, he made me become stronger, to realize that I can take care of myself. They went outside. The spring sun was flooding the city with warm light. Elizabeth took a deep breath of fresh air. By the way, Mary smiled slyly, that nice conductor I told you about will be at the concert. He's also recently been widowed. Mary, Elizabeth laughed. I'm not ready for a new relationship just yet. Not yet, her friend emphasized, but you will be someday. And this time, you'll know how to tell the difference between real feelings and games. Elizabeth thought about her apartment, which she had kept, about the job she loved, about her friends who supported her in her time of need, about her daughter, who was proud of her courage. You know, she said, looking at the bright spring sky, the most important thing is not to be afraid to be yourself, not to be afraid to be alone, not to be afraid to start over. And not to be afraid to say no, Mary added. Exactly, Elizabeth smiled. Life is beautiful when you're free, really free. They walked down the street, two elegant women who knew the value of true friendship and freedom. And somewhere far away, there was a man who thought he could buy love with beautiful words and expensive gifts. A man who did not understand the main thing. True power is not in conquering others, but in remaining true to yourself. Elizabeth no longer wore her diamond ring, but something much more valuable now shone in her eyes, the self-confidence and calmness of a person who knows her true worth.